Rockwall Prez, good morning and happy Sunday. And to our mothers, we would love to wish you a happy Mother's Day. It's good to worship with you in spirit and in truth. And please know the Swindle family misses you all very much. And we can't wait to worship with you together again. The other day I was studying when I heard a distinct cry from the other room. It was a cry for help. And I dropped everything and I ran across the room. And that's where I found Caedmon and Reese and Pearl play fighting one another with lightsabers and tree branches. The room was full of noise and the whipping of wind and the clash of sword play. And it was 2 against 1, and the odds were not good. But there in the middle was our 3-year-old, holding her own, defending herself against the forces of evil, fighting to defend a kingdom of her own making. Now Pearl was winning, but it was only for the time being. Her older brother and her sister were humoring her, and they were tired of getting whipped. They were starting to lose their patience, and I could tell that they were thinking about fighting back and putting this 3-year-old in her place. Caedmon and Reese started swinging their sticks harder and harder, and of course, their attacks only made Pearl swing all the more. She was using both her hands, lifting them up over her head and bringing her lightsaber down as hard as she could with all the might she could muster. For a second, I could have thought that one of the Star Wars movies was being made in my front room. But how long could she keep this up? How long could she last against 2 towering siblings? She was fighting for her life, and she was all alone with no protection. She needed a banner. And she needed some marching orders. You see, she was aimless. She had no purpose, no mission beyond herself. She needed more than saving. She needed a king, and she needed a better kingdom. And I'd say the same is true of us. We're fighting, and it may seem like we're winning for the time being. But before long, the tide always turns against us. And our worst fears and our deepest failures crowd around us. Shame rises up and it draws its sharp sword against us. Our stresses and our anxieties come out as if from nowhere. We are constantly plagued by doubts on all sides, and peace and rest become nothing but distant memories. And in the face of dangers, we insist on fighting all the more. Refusing to give in, refusing to doubt, refusing to betray our deepest convictions. And then we look up and we realize that we're fighting all alone and that no one else is left around us. That's because we're fighting for our own kingdoms. And like Pearl, we find ourselves needing more than saving. Yes, we would love rescue. We would love to call in the cavalry. But even if the cavalry came into our rescue and defeated all of our foes, we would still be left standing all alone. Once the dust settled, we would still find ourselves all by our lonesome, an army of one, aimless, with no purpose, with no mission beyond ourselves. What we need is a king. What we need is a better kingdom. And today's passage shows us that Jesus is the very king that we need, and that his kingdom is far better than any kingdom that we could ever make for ourselves. Mark tells us that after the Last Supper, Jesus and the disciples sang a hymn and they took a walk to the Mount of Olives. And on the way, Jesus spoke to them about the things that were about to take place. He tells them that they will all fall away to fulfill the prophecy of Zechariah. But then he also says that he'll rise again and that he'll meet them in Galilee. Now, Peter insists that he will not fall away like his other disciples. Jesus rebukes Peter, saying, not only will he fall away, but he'll fall away 3 times. And still, Peter insists that he will do no such thing. And the other disciples, they nod their heads in agreement. Now, you know this story well, especially so close to Easter. So you must be wondering where the king and the kingdom is in this passage. You see, typically when we consider this passage, we focus on what Peter is saying and how he denies the Lord, and then how he goes on to deny him 3 times in the court of the high priest. Instead of focusing on what Peter says, I'd like to focus on what Jesus says, because you see, Jesus has good news for the disciples, and they miss his good news. And he has good news for us, and I do not want us to miss it. To understand this passage, we have to bring the Old Testament into the New. Jesus quotes Zechariah saying, "You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will scatter." We know this verse, and we know how the disciples stray one by one from Jesus' side. But what Jesus is telling us is not about the disciples. What he's telling us is that he is Zechariah's shepherd. Now, the important thing to know about Zechariah's shepherd is that he's far more than a shepherd. You see, Zechariah's shepherd is a king. In Zechariah 9, the prophet says, "On that day, the Lord their God will save them as a flock of his people, for like the jewels of a crown, they shine on his land." Zechariah's shepherd tends to a flock that is beautiful, that shine like the jewels in his kingly crown. And in chapter 12, Zechariah shows us how the king will save his people. He talks about how the king will be slain by his own, that he will be pierced in his side, and that from his side grace and mercy will pour out on his people. Grace and mercy will pour out on those who mourn and on those who betray him, even his very own, and he will call them his. Now, Jesus quotes Zechariah, but then he turns around and he tells the disciples something crazy. He says that he will rise again. And not only that, he's going to meet them back home in Galilee. He says that he will gather those that will stray from him, and that he will gather them to himself. Now, here he is in the shadow of the cross, walking toward death. And what is he thinking about? All he can think about is his sheep. All he can think about is saving them. This is how we know that he's a real shepherd, because he knows what happens when the shepherd is separated from his sheep. He knows the dangers that await them, and he worries about it. He worries about it. It's all he can think about. And how comforting is it to know that he's thinking about his sheep? How comforting is it to know that he's a real shepherd? How comforting is it to know that he loves his sheep, even at the very end? He longed to save them, but he also longed to meet them in Galilee, to gather them to himself, even after their betrayal, and to reconcile with them. He longed to ease their burdened, betraying hearts with forgiveness for their good and for his good pleasure. This is exactly what Zechariah's shepherd means to do. He will gather those that have strayed, and he will look on the ones that pierced his side, and they will mourn. And he will pour out his grace and mercy on them, and he will call them his very own. But Zechariah goes one step further. Zechariah shows us the salvation of his people at the hands of his shepherd king. But he knows that salvation isn't enough. He knows that what his people need is a purpose, a mission in this world. And so he longs for a kingdom. He longs for a kingdom worthy of the name of his shepherd king. He longs for a kingdom that's worthy of his glory, one that covers the whole earth, one that no one will stand against. And what then will the shepherd king do with his people? Well, he will gather them to himself, and together they will share the kingdom and advance the line and rule side by side. This is what Jesus means to say when he says that he's going to rise again and meet the disciples in Galilee, that he is the shepherd king, and that he will come and gather his sheep, even those who pierced his side, even the ones that require his grace and his mercy. He will gather these and he will save them, because they are his and he is theirs. But unto what end? Why will he save them? You see, this king, he means to have a kingdom. He means to gather his people so that together they might share and advance his good work. So what do the disciples make of all this? What do the disciples make of Jesus' kingdom? Well, as you well know, Peter completely misses the point. Now, Jesus is talking about him betraying, but also he's saying that he's going to gather him to himself, that he's going to find the betrayer and he's going to meet him and forgive him. But all Peter can hear is that he's a betrayer, and he can't abide by that. And so all Peter can do is deny. He can't hear the Lord. Instead, he denies what the Lord is saying. He strives. He works hard. He's most concerned with proving Jesus wrong at this point. He insists that he'll never deny the one he loves. And he's ready to fight. He's ready to fight to prove the point. He's ready to draw his sword in the name of king and kingdom. The problem is, Peter's kingdom is not Jesus' kingdom. Peter is fighting for a kingdom of his own making. His is a kingdom he builds all of his own accord with the strength of his will and for his own good purposes. In Peter's kingdom, there is no peace. There's no rest, because you see, in a kingdom of strength, you are constantly fighting against failure. And when you do fail, you can't live with yourself, can you? And you don't know what to do. Now, maybe next time you'll shame yourself enough so that you can resist failure a little longer. But failure is inevitable, is it not? And you can't do any better. And slowly, what do? Slowly, you become frustrated with yourself. Slowly, you become angry with yourself. And over time, maybe you even learn to hate yourself. Now, this was Peter's kingdom. And we know this because our kingdoms are just like Peter's. And we know, and we can say very easily, very readily, that Peter needs a new kingdom. But can we be honest with ourselves? And can we say that we, too, need new and better kingdoms of our own? Fortunately, Peter's kingdom is not meant to last, and neither is ours. Because just as Zechariah says, the betrayer is bound to look on the one he betrayed. And when Peter looked on the one he betrayed, he saw the king for who he really was. And when he saw the king, he mourned his betrayal. He mourned his sin. And from the king's side poured grace and mercy, the very grace and mercy that he never thought that he needed. You see, sheep, they may stray, but the shepherd will not rest till they are safely in the fold. But I wonder, what happens to Peter after he denies? What happens to Peter after he betrays? Well, we don't find out in Mark, but Luke tells us that Jesus had asked Peter for a favor. In Luke, Jesus asked Peter to strengthen the brothers after his time of temptation had passed. To strengthen the brothers, the very brothers that he said that he was stronger than. You see, Peter was asked by Jesus to serve a cause greater than himself. The king was not satisfied with saving him. No, instead, Jesus knew that Peter was aimless, so he gave him over to a calling. He gave him over to a bigger purpose. He gave him over to a better kingdom. But Peter is a failure, is he not? He betrayed his Lord, the very one that he swore to stand beside no matter what, even if it cost him his life. How can Peter feel like anything but a failure? We know because we feel like failures. We know because we betray the Lord, just like Peter. We know what it means, and we know what it feels like to see our kingdoms fall. And the same is true of Peter. Remember that Peter is outdone at the very end, not by a strong and mighty warrior. Peter is outdone by a tiny servant girl of the high priest. And that servant girl puts Peter in his place. And that servant girl makes Peter cry. Peter feels like we feel most of the time. All his strength has left him, and all he knows is shame. Shame in Jesus' forgiveness. How then is Peter supposed to strengthen his brothers? How then are we supposed to strengthen our brothers and our sisters? Peter would strengthen the brothers with a word, the only hope he had left. Peter would strengthen them with good news, the very news that Jesus gave him in the first place, that Jesus would rise again, and that Jesus would meet him in Galilee, that he would gather his sheep, even those that had strayed, and that he would pour out his grace and mercy on them, and that Jesus would meet them, and he would reconcile with them, and remove the burden of their betrayers' hearts. And Peter would remind them that Jesus is the shepherd king, and that he means to have a kingdom, and that his kingdom is far better than any kingdom that we can make for ourselves. So how do we strengthen the brothers? And how do the brothers and sisters strengthen us? When we find ourselves fighting for our own kingdoms and failing, living by our own strength and losing, we must point one another to a better kingdom. We must point one another to a better king. When we behold the wounds in his side, we will see him for the king that he is, and we will remember the grace and mercy he pours out on us, and we will understand that his kingdom is far better than the kingdoms of strength that we would build for ourselves. When we feel burdened by our own betrayals, we must remind one another that our great shepherd is waiting for us in Galilee, that he's been waiting for us all the while since before the foundation of the world, waiting to meet us, to gather us to himself, and to reconcile with us. He's waiting for us, the very ones who pierced his side. He's waiting for us, the ones that can't seem to do anything right. He's waiting for us, the ones who feel like failures half the time, the ones who feel too exhausted, too weak, too tired to be loved by anyone. You may have forsaken him, but he will not forsake you. He is risen, and he is waiting for you in Galilee. Lastly, we must remind one another that our King will have his kingdom. He shows us grace and mercy, yes, and he reconciles with us, yes, but he does not stop there. He longs to share his kingdom with us. He longs to share his purpose with us. He longs to share his mission with us, a mission that's far greater than any one of us. He longs to see us by his side. He longs to see us advancing his line in the stories we tell, in the testimonies that we give of how we were down and out, and then the Lord gathered us to himself. He longs to see us demonstrating grace in a tangible way in this world that is in dire and desperate need of mercy. Together, let us show the world that his kingdom has come. Together, let us show the world that his kingdom is much better than ours. So anyways, whatever happened to Pearl? As I said, the kids were fighting one another with tree branches and with lightsabers. And she was winning, but her older brother and sister were getting tired of being whipped, and they were losing their patience with her. They were getting ready to put this uppity 3-year-old in her place. She was swinging her lightsaber overhead with all the might she could muster. But how long could she last on her own? She was aimless. She had no purpose, no mission beyond herself. She needed a king. She needed a better kingdom. And so I decided to pick up a tree branch and join the fight. And together, Pearl and I advanced our kingdom as far as the eye could see. And when we were done, She threw down her lightsaber, and she flipped her hair, and she smiled a big pearly smile at me. And I could tell that she was far happier fighting with her king. Far happier fighting with her king than fighting alone. Are you tired of fighting alone? Do you need a king? Do you need a better kingdom? Well, then hear the good news. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel of the King